Vice President J.D. Vance made a landmark speech resetting the EU-US relationship on security, but are there implications for international trade as well? Joining us now in the studio to discuss is Professor Tim Harcourt, UTS, and also host of the Airport Economist channel right here on Ticker. Great to see you face to face.
Good to be here in the wonderful Ticker studios. Very impressive.
Absolutely. All right. What a speech. What did you make of it?
Well, quite a landmark speech. I mean, normally these speeches by a vice president would be pretty much platitudes, and talking about trade and perhaps a bit of protectionism. But he went right through to the core values of the EU and European democracy, and basically said you've put yourself under threat. Even more than Vladimir Putin could do. So it was quite extraordinary. It's
interesting, one of the things he said was, you all know, and I've spoken to you all, about what you're trying to protect Europe from, but you don't know what you're trying to protect Europe for. And I thought that was such an extraordinary thing, because you can imagine what they're trying to protect Europe from is the far right. And we saw in 1940s and the late 30s what can happen if the far right get into power. His point is, here's a mirror, the far right are back. What have you done to get here? Let's have a listen to J.D. Vance.
And of all the pressing challenges that the nations represented here face, I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration. Today, almost 1 in 5 people living in this country moved here from abroad. That is, of course, an all-time high. It's a similar number, by the way, in the United States, also an all-time high. The number of immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries doubled between 2021 and 2022 alone, and of course, it's gotten much higher since. And we know this situation, it didn't materialize in a vacuum. It's the result of a series of conscious decisions made by politicians all over the continent and others across the world over the span of a decade.
He's essentially saying, Tim, that you need to get your act together on these issues because people are noticing and they're voting in the right. What do you make of it all?
Look, I think you're right in the sense that Europe was forged because France and Germany never wanted to go to war again. They didn't want to ever return to the far right, given their experience.
Well, J.D. Vance has certainly brought France and Germany together on this issue. They both were very angry about his speech.
Well, they are, and also their supremacy of the EU has been challenged by Italy, by Hungary, by some of the newcomers that have joined the EU, like Poland.
Italy and Hungary both have right-wing leadership now.
They do indeed, and they've been quite outspoken on the same issues that Trump and Vance have. But it's interesting, you've got the fear of the far right, you've got anti-Semitism on the left that is also affecting European politics, and you've got basically this question, what is European values? With fundamentalist Islam making a big play for European society, Vance is now asking, what are your values? How are you going to basically defend your values and your democracy, and plays into a lot of the tech arguments as well.
It has become, it's interesting you say that about the anti-Semitism on the left, because if you think about the US election, it's often said that the Jewish vote always goes to the Democrats, who are of the left. If you think about Australia, where we've seen pro-Palestinian rallies happening every Sunday for quite some time, post-October the 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel, it has been a huge number of pro-Palestinians in the city, and then the far right turn up to defend the country. And it's just completely switched around. What is going on?
Well, it's extraordinary because, Israel used to be the underdog and the typical, Jewish family in the 60s in Australia or America were lefties, and now basically they feel let down by the left of centre, the Democrats and the Labor Party here. The Green movement has got very anti-Semitic. It used to be about trees, now it's very anti-Semitic.
Which is interesting because their vote is now declining significantly as they move into social issues and away from the environmental issues as well. Just bringing it back to the Munich conference, you mentioned at the start there that usually when a vice president speaks in Europe, it's kind of so-so, who cares? But some actually have blamed Kamala Harris as vice president, who back in 2020 spoke in Europe about Ukraine potentially being open to joining NATO, that some say led to Vladimir Putin's kicking off the war in Ukraine. Vice President speeches can do a lot.
I find it hard to blame Kamala Harris for Putin expanding into Ukraine, but it is true. I mean, Vance has made an impact.
He says the reason that he had to take on Ukraine was because he had to stop it from joining NATO. That, I think, is the link.
Yeah, and also his claims on the Crimea, and you can go back thousands of years of Vladimir Putin's case for Ukraine and Russia. But what's interesting is, I mean, Vance has got impact because he's going to be a likely successor to the Trump movement. You didn't see Mike Pence making speeches like that, not with the same impact.
Well, no, and certainly because Mike Pence was more of the kind of Bush-style Republican than the MAGA-style Republican that we have here now as well. Let's have a listen to how President Trump reacted back in the Oval Office to questions about that speech.
Well, I heard his speech, and I tell you, you're talking about JD's speech, right?
Yes, sir.
I heard his speech, and he talked about freedom of speech, and I think it's true in Europe. It's losing. They're losing their wonderful right of freedom of speech. I see it. I mean, I thought he made a very good speech, actually, a very brilliant speech. Yeah. Europe has to be careful. And he talked about immigration. And Europe has a big immigration problem. Just take a look at what's happened with crime. Take a look at what's happening in various parts of Europe. I thought his speech was very well received, actually. I've heard very good remarks.
All right, President Trump speaking there in the Oval Office. You know who wasn't in the Oval Office? Was AP, the Associated Press. And there's President Trump hitting out at the Europeans over free speech. He's just banned a legitimate news organisation from being in the Oval Office or boarding Air Force One because he isn't happy that they aren't renaming the Gulf of America to the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. What are your views on that? Because when we talk about free speech, you can't be selective over which speech is free.
I think when he invited the bloggers and the new media into the White House, I thought that was good, and I'm sure Ticker got a pass as soon as that came up.
By sending you over.
Yeah, that's right. I thought that was a good move rather than banning people. I thought expanding is better. It's interesting, the issue with the tech giants and censorship, and your discussion previously about fact-checking, who's going to check the fact-checkers and so on. It's interesting, you know, the E-Safety Commissioner from Australia is trying to ban the video of those two pro-Hamas nurses from Bankstown Hospital, and I'm just thinking, well, come on. I mean, is that her
I
role?
can't believe she's having another go after losing so fatefully to Elon Musk over the video of the preacher being attacked there in again another similar story. That terrible knife attack that happened in Sydney. What was it, last year or the year before? Now I'm losing track.
She tried on that, and now she said that if we have that video going around, it'll cause Islamophobia. Well. Phobia is fear of, is an irrational fear. When two people say they want to kill every Israeli and they're nurses, that's not an irrational fear.
No, it's something that would be pretty terrifying for those people. Now, back on Europe, you've got President Zelensky sitting by as his country is being spoken about. Is it as simple as Ukraine just lost the war? And despite their best efforts, despite Europe's best efforts, despite billions of dollars and weapons being sent, despite longer range weapons and aircraft that at first weren't going to be allowed and then allowed, and drone attacks on Moscow and a bit of an advance in the Kursk region, the Russians ended up taking 20% of the country. And if we don't want this to spiral out of control and for more and more people and for the West to end up having to put boots on the ground themselves to help Ukraine defend itself, there's no other choice but to capitulate. Is that what is happening here?
You hear such different reports, don't you? You hear that Trump has told Putin, Ukraine's going to be in NATO, but you can have the Crimea. You know, there's all this horse trading.
And then you hear he's been told it will never be in NATO.
Yeah, on the other hand, and then you feel always that Europe never went in hard for Ukraine. You know, they did things, dribs and drabs. And
they said nice things.
They said nice things. They didn't do a lot because they so feared an escalation. And so I feel that Ukraine got some support, but they didn't get the full red-blooded support.
Then you hear from others who say that President Putin of Russia was quite shocked that Europe came to the support of Ukraine, and then that prevented his army from being able to roll in with the kind of catastrophic opening scene that would have taken over Kiev and taken over the country quite quickly. So again, you hear different things. I mean, remember that first year where we're hearing that Putin was probably dead and that there were body doubles or that he was about to die. I mean, the amount of propaganda that has come from the West has been really obvious this time around. Usually we kind of fall for it, but this time people were stepping up saying this doesn't quite add up to what we're seeing here. How does it change Europe post-Ukraine?
I think Europe's in a difficult position. I must say, though, the Ukrainian president's been pretty brave, and so the
unbelievable.
Ukrainian community. I mean, and one thing that I have great admiration for how he's conducted himself in such trying circumstances. I wonder to what extent this is a bit of a wake-up call for Europe for their own preservation, not only in terms of that border, but also how they handle new members. I mean, Poland's been a big supporter of Ukraine, but also these other issues that Vance talked about in his speech. Illegal immigration, the attack on European values, and a lot of violent attacks that we even saw in Munich.
Let's have a listen now to President Zelensky.
Putin has lost almost 250,000 soldiers in this war. Over 610,000 have been wounded. Just in the Battle of Kursk, our troops eliminated nearly 20,000 Russian soldiers. We completely destroyed the North Korean units that Putin had to bring in because his own forces were not enough.
All right, and now President Zelensky has since done an interview with NBC News in the United States saying we won't be part or agree to any discussions that we aren't a part of. And now that obviously adds concern for President Trump's team, who are meeting and trying to come up with a ceasefire plan. But also now you've got France entering the fray as well. And France is the kind of wild card in all of this. They seem to enjoy being the wild card if you think about what happened in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars as well. Where is France on this? And is it a case of we are Europe, get out of here, United States, or is Macron on the wrong path?
You don't know with Macron, doesn't he? Because he was boasting that he could talk to Putin more than any other leader in Europe. So we don't know
what did that achieve.
Well, nothing did it. I mean, and so we don't know to what extent he can back up what he says. But it is a wild card, and you got to say, I mean, why is Ukraine not at the table? I mean, that's quite extraordinary. And
is it because Zelensky has stood his ground that he won't give up that 20% of territory that Russia now has in the far east of the country near Crimea, and therefore President Trump says, well, sorry, mate, but you've lost that territory and there's no way to overcome it? I mean, is it just simply the art of the deal is to make sure that you don't have too many people in the room?
Well, that's part of his art of the deal. I mean, you hear different things about the Middle East too, don't you? You hear that the US envoy went in pretty hard on Netanyahu, and he was quite shocked by that. But to some extent, we've now made more progress than we had under Biden. So it's interesting. It's almost like Trump's tactics are so unexpected that they catch everyone by surprise.
If you were to come up with a prediction as to what happens with Ukraine, let's go past the talks that are happening at the moment. Does President Zelensky last as president? You think about Churchill being a great prime minister during the war. Zelensky hasn't had an election. Elections have been put off, which he's been criticised for. How can you be defending democracy when you're not having elections at the same time? Will he face an election after an agreement? Is that one of the reasons why he doesn't want to necessarily end the war on Russia's terms, because he quite likes the job? What are your thoughts there?
I think he'll have an election soon after some sort of settlement. I don't know whether it'll be a Churchill-Attlee situation, because Churchill was shocked by that. That was the blessing in disguise, and I think he said to his wife, it was a very good disguise. But it's interesting. We haven't had elections in Gaza for a long time, and the West Bank. So it's a question of if you want to defend democracy, you do have to hold elections.
Well, let's talk about that, because right now we've got the United States sending envoys around the world, to Europe and of course to the Middle East, to try to end two wars that could drastically get out of control. We've seen Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, standing side by side with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, another man who has faced a lot of criticism, obviously, for being too strong. We see the US now shifting their focus away from Gaza and to Iran, who they believe to be the anti-US puppet masters behind so much of the drama that we see day to day, year after year in the Middle East. What do you think about that shift and naming them so forthrightly?
Yeah, I think we've danced around this for a long time. But on this show, we've said, basically the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas are run by Iran. We know that, and you can see now almost Trump's. I'm going to create this great. Riviera, Gaza, Riviera of the Mediterranean. I think that was a play to pull in Jordan, Egypt, the Saudis, the other more moderate Arab states, because they know if they can isolate Iran, he can get maybe not a perfect settlement, but towards a settlement. So I think the game is to try and draw the moderate Arab nations in with almost shock tactics in terms of his announcement.
What do you think of Trump's plan for Gaza, the idea of a Riviera and kind of the Atlantic City of the Middle East, where we can see beautiful hotels and it could become an aviation stopover like we see in Dubai, for example? What do you make of it? Do you think it's possible, and do you worry about the idea of Palestinians being forced away?
It's not practical. I think he did it to say to people, use your imagination, this could be a great part of the world, and Gaza could be fantastic. And if you think about it, every time there's been a peace settlement or peace offering for land for Palestinians, I mean, they end up building tunnels and, you know, attacking Israel, where they could, you know, have an economic agreement with Israel and the other UAE and the other nations in the Middle East.
President Trump was criticised for, during his first administration, pulling out of the nuclear agreement with Iran, that many say led to Iran continuing their efforts to rebuild the bomb, and the belief was that the only people that would be able to stop Iran would be the Israelis, who haven't really attacked the nuclear facilities. In fact, over the past year, we saw the retaliation, the tit for tat that was happening through Lebanon and what was happening there with Hezbollah, that the Biden administration was actually pleading with Netanyahu to not attack Iran's nuclear facilities because that would escalate things. Do you think that in hindsight, Trump's actions on Iran were right? And what does it tell us about what he'll do next with Iran? It's one thing to point the finger at them, but what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I think Obama and Julie Bishop and the government here made a mistake with Iran, but I think the Iran regime is weak. You know, we're seeing a big movement within Iran itself. I mean, the Persians have a beautiful culture. They don't want to be ruled by, you know, these despots. And eventually, as Iran weakens, I think that'll force the hand of the region. And you know, with a restoration of the monarchy, you know, the Shah's son's been pretty vocal lately. That could have big implications for Israel and for the Middle East, and perhaps, you know, I mean, we always say we wish, but maybe some sign of a better days for the Middle East.
And let's bring it back to trade. That is, of course, you are the airport economist. We've spoken about the airport side of geopolitics, but let's talk about the economist side now as well. First, we'll start with Europe. The conversation between the United States and Europe is kind of happening under the umbrella of tariffs that Trump may throw at the Europeans, just as he has with China as well. There's always been this tit for tat that happens, the antitrust cases in Europe against Apple and big American companies. It feels like it happen all the time. We have a USB-C on the bottom of our iPhones these days, thanks to the Europeans. What do you make of the trade relationships around the world that Trump's trying to forge out?
The great irony, of course, is the Europeans have been the great protectionists, so it's very hard for them to hark up against tariffs where Australia and Canada can, quite rightly. So I think that's going to play a role. And I think you're right with the tech giants. I mean, a lot of that speech by Vance was not just about immigration and democracy. It was about the threatening free speech, the threatening of free media, and they feel that you know, the Europeans, through, you know, various regulations, are trying to strangle it. Whilst the Europeans would say, well, we're trying to adversely, you know, take on American dominance.
The vibe of J.D. Vance's speech was, stop coming and expecting the United States to fix your problems, to keep sending you money, and you send us back some crocodile handbags to sell to us at high prices. Would you agree that's pretty much what he was saying, is this relationship has to be reset?
And I think that's the Trump administration in a nutshell, isn't it? It's about, we don't get good deals. America gets ripped off by all our friends as well as our enemies. So he's trying to reset it. But the trouble is it can cause instability in international institutions. And that's what we're worried about as economists, that if we, you know, upset the WTO and a lot of these institutions...
Right. This is a great place to take this conversation, because I have debates every week with our US Bureau Chief talking on Ticker Hot Shots about what responsibility the United States has around the world. The Trump view is we have none and we don't owe the world anything. But another perspective is that post-World War II, American companies have done so well by inserting themselves into the economies of foreign governments. If you think about Australia, our car industry, if you want a drink, you're most likely to get a Coke. Or if you want fast food, you're most likely to turn to an American conglomerate that has very much helped the US economy. If you want to buy a plane or fly on a plane, there was a time where Australia used to build its own aircraft. These days, you get on a Boeing most of the time in Australia, or sometimes an Airbus, but mostly a Boeing. The US has done very, very well post-World War II by creating huge businesses. Most financial trade goes through those big banks down the southern tip of Manhattan. The IMF is based there, etc. The US has done very well out of global trade. Pulling it back, does it not break the equilibrium where governments can then say, all right, get out of our country?
Well, furthermore, in a sense, international trade and the US's role has actually reduced poverty, particularly in the Asia Pacific, if you think about the last 40 years. So in some ways, my counter to Vance and Trump would be, you're actually improving American standing around the world, because trade and even US aid has reduced poverty, and at the same time, you're spreading democracy. So ultimately, if you want more freedom and democracy around the world, you're going to get it, and also your companies will be very successful in the process. So given how successful America was in the 20th century, why put that in jeopardy?
And we'll talk about the Middle East just finally in terms of from an economic standpoint. It's often said that the US went into Iraq because of oil. It's often said that the whole Middle Eastern economy is based on selling oil to the West and to other countries as well. What do you think from an economic standpoint Trump's viewpoint is and plan is? We know geopolitically we spoke about Gaza and the Riviera. We know Iran controls a lot of the world's oil as well. We know there's BRICS too. The countries like Russia and China and India, and Narendra Modi was in the US at the White House last week for a state visit. What do you make of Trump's economic view of fixing the Middle East?
Well, I think he's just got to try to reduce the dependence on oil in a sense, and so a nation like Iran can't hold the United States to hostage like they did with President Carter, and literally held hostages. So
the left viewpoint of that was to bring in renewables. Trump is saying that the answer isn't renewables in the US, it's drill, baby, drill.
And not just oil. I mean, so he, fracking gas and so on. I think he's trying to, it's forget Paris, pull back from those targets, and look at a whole gamut of things to look at climate change. But ultimately, I think it's about power, and it's about reducing Iranian influence.
Professor Tim Harcourt, as always, appreciate it, and great to see you here in the studio.
Likewise, Aaron, great to be here.